The Battle of Little Bighorn.
Bighorn began when American Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led federal troops against the combined forces of the Lakota Sioux, the Northern Cheyenne, and the Arapaho Plains Indians. Also known as Custer's Last Stand, the battle was one of the most significant clashes of the Great Sioux War of 1876. The Black Hills of South Dakota were sacred to the Plains Indians, and they had been recognized as such in the Fort Laramie Treaty that was signed in 1868. However, the discovery of gold in the same hills just 6 years later led to a gold rush of white settlers in breach of the treaty. Sitting Bull inspired fellow Plains Indians to form an alliance against the invasion of their lands, and by late spring 1876, thousands of warriors had joined him at the Little Bighorn River in an area that they referred to as the Greasy Grass. Determined to drive the natives back to the reservations, the U.S. Army dispatched cavalry to engage them. When Custer, leading the 7th Cavalry Regiment, spotted a Sioux camp on the 25th of June, he decided to attack it with his 600 men. However, the Indian forces outnumbered his troops, and Custer was soon the victim of a pincer movement when Crazy Horse led another group of Sioux to surround him. Within an hour, Custer and his men were dead, having been overwhelmed by up to 3,000 warriors. However, news of the defeat prompted outrage amongst many white Americans, and, over the next year, the Sioux gradually surrendered following continued U.S. Army attacks against their property.
The video was a brief summary of what occurred at the Battle of Little Bighorn. We will be giving in-depth description of what really happened, starting with
In 1873, Custer was first faced with the two Lakota leaders, known as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. Who would have known in the year to come they played a big part in Custer's demise. Sitting Bull was a Native American chief under whom the Sioux tribes united in their struggle for survival on the North American Great Plains. Crazy Horse was an Oglala Sioux Indian chief who fought against removal reservation. Crazy Horse, alongside of Chief Sitting Bull, united for the Battle of Little Bighorn. In 1868, the U.S. signed a treaty agreeing that the South Dakota Black Hills to be recognized as part of the Sioux Reservation. 6 years later, gold was discovered in the Black Hills, and the U.S. changed their mind due to greed for the gold.
However, the Native Americans simply wouldn't just give the land back. This ignited the Great Battle of Little Bighorn. Custer was given the job of relocating all Indians in the area. George Armstrong Custer was an officer and commander in the Civil War and the American Indian War. He had deserted his army to be with his wife and came back in 1868. Custer had even earned a certificate for teaching at a grammar school before he joined the army. In late spring of 1876, more than 10,000 Native Americans had camped along the Little Bighorn River. As this continued, the U.S. had urged hunters to massacre buffaloes and even let trains stop and let people hurt buffaloes so that Indians wouldn't have materials or resources. This made the Indians angrier with the U.S. At this point, the U.S. Army had sent Custer and the 7th Cavalry to round up all Indians and take them to the reservations.
The U.S. Army had a plan to surround the Native American Army at Little Bighorn River and force them to surrender. They decided to have Custer move in and surround the Indians with his 7th Cavalry and wait for reinforcements, but things didn't go as planned. As Custer waited, he thought that the Indians discovered his position, and he split his 600 men into 4 different groups to prevent the Indians from escaping. They underestimated the size of the Indian army, and the other 3 groups fled after losing a significant amount of numbers. Custer, along with his two brothers, brother-in-law, and his nephew, were all slaughtered that day with his 210 men. Nobody knows the specifics of what happened because none of his men lived to tell the tale. The battle was lost, and it was a great tragedy. But over the next coming year, the U.S. Army triumphed over the Indians and forced them to surrender. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull were put in reservations and died several years later. And that concludes the Battle of Little Bighorn.